Yeah. You. Furious words, these last words that I had ended my first half of the speech on, were furious words from rural men and women who were traditionally conservative and whose memories of taming the frontier were fresh and personal. But in their fury, they invoked an American tradition as powerful as frontier individualism, the war on inequality, and especially on the role that government played in promoting and preserving inequality by favoring the rich. The Founding Fathers turned their backs on the idea of property qualifications for holding office under the Constitution because they wanted no part of a veneration for wealth in the document. Thomas Jefferson, while claiming no interest in politics, built up a Republican Party, which has no relation to the present one, to take the government back from the speculators and stock jobbers, as he called them, who were in the saddle in 1800. Andrew Jackson slew the monster Second Bank of the United States, the 600-pound gorilla of the credit system back in the 1830s, in the name of the people versus the aristocrats who sat on the bank's governing board. All of these leaders were on the record in favor of small government. But their opposition wasn't simply to government as such. It was to government's power to confer privilege on insiders, on the rich, who were democracy's equivalent of the royal favorites of monarchist days. The populists knew it was the government that granted millions of acres of public land to the railroad builders. It was the government that gave the manufacturers of farm machinery a monopoly on the domestic market by a protective tariff that was no longer necessary to shelter infant industries. It was the government that contracted the national currency and sparked a deflationary cycle that crushed debtors and fattened the wallets of creditors. And those who made the great fortunes used them to buy the legislative and the judicial favors that kept them on top. So the populists recognized one great principle: the job of preserving equality of opportunity and of preserving democracy demanded the end of any unholy alliance between government and wealth. It was, to quote that platform again, from the same womb of governmental injustice that tramps and millionaires were bred. But how? How was the democratic revolution to be revived? The promise of the Declaration reclaimed. How were Americans to restore government to its job of promoting the general welfare? And here, the populists made a breakthrough to another principle. In a modern, large-scale, industrial, and nationalized economy, it wasn't enough simply to curb the government's outreach. That would simply leave power in the hands of the great corporations whose existence was inseparable from growth and progress. The answer was to turn government into an active player in the economy, at the very least enforcing fair play, and when necessary, being the friend, the helper, and the agent of the people at large in the contest against entrenched power. So, the populist platform called for government loans to farmers about to lose their mortgaged homesteads, for government granaries to grade and store their crops fairly, for governmental inflation of the currency, which was a classical plea of debtors, and for some decidedly non-classical actions, like government ownership of the railroad, telephone, telegraph systems, and a graduated, or in other words, a progressive tax on incomes, and a flat ban on any subsidies to any private corporation. And to make sure that the government stayed on the side of the people, the pops, or populists, called for the initiative and referendum and the direct election of senators. Predictably, the populists were denounced. They were feared and mocked as fanatical hayseeds, ignorantly playing with socialist fire. They got 22 electoral votes for their candidate in 1892, plus some congressional seats and state houses, but it was downhill from there for many reasons. America wasn't, and probably still isn't, ready for a new major party. The People's Party was a spent rocket by 1904. But if political organizations perish, their key ideas don't. Keep that in mind, because it gives perspective to your cause today. Much of the populist agenda would become law within a few years of the party's extinction. And that was because it was generally shared by a rising generation of young Republicans and Democrats who, justly or not, were seen as less outrageously outdated than the embattled farmers. These were the progressives. These were your intellectual forebears and mine. One of my heroes in all of this is William Allen White, a Kansas country editor, a Republican, who was one of them. He described his fellow progressives this way: what the people felt about the vast injustice that had come with the settlement of a continent, we, their servants, teachers, city councilors, legislators, governors, publishers, editors, writers, representatives in Congress, senators, we all made a part of our creed. Some way into the hearts of the dominant middle class of this country had come a sense that their civilization needed recasting and that their government had fallen into the hands of self-seekers, that a new relationship should be established between the haves and the have-nots. They were a diverse lot, held together by a common admiration of progress, hence the name progressives. And they shared dismay at the paradox of poverty stubbornly persisting in the midst of progress, like an unwanted guest at a wedding. Of course, they welcomed, just as we do now, the new marvels in the gift bag of technology: telephones, automobiles, electrically powered urban transport, lighting systems, the indoor heating and plumbing, the processed foods, the home appliances, the machine-made clothing that reduced the sweat and drudgery of homemaking and were affordable to an ever-swelling number of people. But they could see the underside of all of this too: the slums lurking in the shadows of the glittering cities, the exploited and unprotected workers whose low-paid labor filled the horn of plenty for others, the misery of those whom age, sickness, accident, or hard times condemned to servitude and poverty with no hope of comfort and security. This is what's hard to believe. Hardly a century had passed since 1776 before the still young revolution was being strangled in the hard grip of a merciless ruling class. The large corporations that were called into being by modern industrialism after 1865, so after the end of the Civil War, had combined into trusts, into monopolies capable of making minions of both politics and government. This is what we saw, a maldistribution of wealth, status, and opportunity. On that terribly pessimistic note, we should pause here, as this is the end of the second part of the speech.